In today's presentation, I also want to thank the Lens. Steve Myers, the editor there, has agreed to present the case about the facts on some of the STR issues. So thank you, Lens, for that. And he will begin the presentation to set the stage for a discussion that hopefully Susan and Joe will be able to talk a little bit more about that issue before we take questions. There are 3 different colored cards, white, blue, and yellow on your table. The instructions about how to use those colored cards are at your table. Please read them and try to comply to the best extent possible. During the presentation, one of us will collect the cards and will pass it on to Keith Twitchell. Keith is the President CEO of Committee for Better New Orleans, and he has agreed to help us with moderating the questions and asking them anonymously. So thank you, Keith. Thank you to Committee for Better New Orleans. And so with that, I'll let Steve begin.
Hi there. My name is Steve Myers. I'm the editor of The Lens. If you're not familiar with The Lens, we're a nonprofit news organization. Our mission is to give you the information to advocate for a functional and accountable government. We've been looking at Airbnb in the city for, I don't know, probably most intensely for about a year since it was legalized. So I'm going to give you some of the sort of the broad overview of what we found about short-term rentals in New Orleans, and use that so that you can kick off your discussion. We are a member-supported organization. Should you care to support us, the Lens NOLA, support.thelensnola.org. And right there, it's a little hard to read. There's a link that anyone can follow along on their phones or computers. It's bit.ly Lens Airbnb April 2018. So the presentation is available to anyone. Just briefly, short-term rentals were illegal in the city until last April. The city, by most accounts, didn't enforce the law, and so then the council, after a long period, agreed to regulate and to legalize them. So our law, if you read this link in the New York Times, it was hailed as a model of cooperation between the needs for a city and for companies in terms of providing data sharing and allowing for some enforcement. And so, there was a big story that promoted this sort of thing. So one of the things we wanted to do at The Lens is to sort of see how this played out on the ground. Oh, sorry. How about now? Good? All right. So some people think that the law is too permissive and that it doesn't have any caps on how many Airbnbs a single person can own, or that it requires people to live on the property. And then there are, in the Airbnb proponents, they've argued that it should be expanded, for instance, to lift the cap on certain kinds of rentals and to allow Airbnbs in the quarter. And Airbnb does provide a way for people to register for a license. They enable that process, and then they also collect some taxes and fees for the city, which the city is using for enforcement. So a brief outline, there are 3 kinds of permits for Airbnbs. One of them is a temporary permit, and it allows an owner or a tenant to rent a full house or apartment up to 90 days a year. So the idea is you go out on a vacation, you want to rent your place, you can rent the entire place for up to 90 days. An accessory permit allows you to rent a portion of your house. And for the purposes of the law, a portion of your house includes half of a double. So you can rent those. There's not, that you can, it authorizes, year-round. There's not a limit on this. So a spare bedroom in your house you can rent, and then if you have half of a double, you can also rent that if you're the owner and you live on the other side. And then the other one is a commercial, where if your property has a commercial or mixed use zoning, then you can rent that year round as well. So those are the three kinds of permits. And as I go on, I'll explain that the way the permitting works is, for me as a reporter, a little difficult to answer some of the questions that people have about how Airbnb is used in the city. The Lens tracks all Airbnb applications. If you go to our homepage, there's a link right at the top, and you can find you can click on the map and you can zoom into your neighborhood. You can find everyone who is running a licensed Airbnb. So if you know that there's an Airbnb operating in your neighborhood, you can go to that map and you can see whether it is actually licensed, and if it's not, then you can contact the city. Here's an example of what it looks like. We have photos of every property and the kind of license that it has. And then the city also has all its permit information online. Ours is it's phone friendly, it's a little easier to use, but we don't update ours every day, and the city's is constantly updated. So to the big question of how many short-term rentals there are 4,500 licensed short-term rentals in the city. The estimates that the City Planning Commission gave, it had a high of about 4,000. So, it seems like that was on track pretty much. This map here shows by approximate density where they're located. So here, you'll notice that we are not the deepest color of red, of purple, and over there in the Marigny, it is. And so the highest concentration of Airbnbs is in the Marigny, where 1 out of every 10 residential properties is a licensed Airbnb. And so we didn't just look at addresses when we did our analysis at the Lens, but we used the Postal Service to identify which are businesses and which are residences, and then we were able to figure that out. So that's the highest. Also popular, as you may imagine, are Bywater, Treme, Lower Garden District. Near the fairgrounds are popular. I was just looking at the map today to confirm, but Carrollton is sort of in the middle. Most of Carrollton. If you go up to Lakeview, there are very few Airbnbs compared to the rest of the city. There's been a lot of discussion about whether Airbnb is driving up rents and the cost of living. The argument for Airbnb is that it enables people to help pay these costs by renting a portion of their house and help them to pay high property taxes, or and enable them to pay for their insurance. And then the opponents are saying that by removing properties from the housing market, you are limiting the supply and you're driving up rents. So what we know is that 72% of licenses allow for the rental of an entire home for part of the year. So that means that 72% of the list of the licenses that are out there, I'm not saying that they are rented for the entire, they are renting the entire unit, but that they allow it. So that includes your commercial and your temporary licenses. It doesn't count your accessories. So the accessories, if you add that in, depending on whether there's a full housing unit, that could increase that. We have looked at a few different studies, and I would say that this New York study that we cited, it did find that Airbnbs raised rent by about $380 a year. There was another Airbnb-funded study that was done locally that looked at housing by zip code, and then it found no discernible impact. The problem, though, is if you live in the 70118 zip code, you're familiar with that there's a huge variation in the housing within that zip code. It stretches all the way from the river up to I-10. And then, of course, the Jane Place study that was released recently found a correlation between Airbnb concentration and rent increases. And we actually looked at this with Huffington Post. We did a big story last year, and their researcher at the Huffington Post looked at census data over the past 15 years, and then we combined that with our own information on concentration of Airbnbs. And what we found is that Airbnbs neighborhoods that are popular on Airbnb have gotten whiter and richer than the rest of the city. So it's true that if you look at from 2000 to 2015, neighborhoods that are popular on Airbnb have become, I believe it's 89%, they've seen an 89% change in the racial makeup, and they've seen the poverty rate has decreased by about, like, let's say, I think it's about 30%. It's a little hard to read on that screen. Now, obviously, Airbnb hasn't been around since 2000. You can't put all of that on Airbnb. I do want to make it, we all often talk about causation and correlation. Our reporting showed that Airbnb appears to be contributing to some of the high cost of living in some of these areas, but we wouldn't say, we don't have the expertise to say whether it's the primary driver at all. And certainly you couldn't say that it's been responsible for the changes since 2000, because as we know, Katrina and other factors have really changed the city a lot. And there are certain neighborhoods that it's possible that they're popular on Airbnb because they're so desirable, and then because they're so desirable, then they're popular on Airbnb. So you can see how those things contribute to one another. Just as an example of the sort of dueling data points, in the Jane Place study, they noted that, they said their findings show that 16% of short-term rental operators control 44% of the listings. So they're talking about a very small number of people who have a large number of listings. And then Airbnb has said 64% of New Orleans hosts are sharing their own primary residence. So those things can both be true. I mean, it's possible that most people on Airbnb, most of the hosts are sharing their primary residence, but yet there is a small number of people who operate a lot of Airbnbs, and that they are making, it's their business. So both of those things may be true. In a way that I think that Jane Place and Airbnb, where they're kind of talking past each other, and of course people use whatever statistics they want to that bolster their case, but this is an example of how that's going on. The other thing, for the purposes of being a journalist and trying to understand these things, there are some limitations on the data. I'd say one of the biggest limitations is that the way the licenses are organized, it doesn't allow for easy parsing of how many of the rentals are for an entire home, and how many of them can be rented year-round. So the fact that you have the same kind of permit authorizing the rental of a spare room as for half of a double, which would be considered a housing unit, that makes it hard for us to decipher how many of those accessory permits are being used for a whole home rental. There are a lot of duplexes and doubles in the city, and so it's a really common type of rental property. And so if we were able to figure that out a little bit, I think that would help get us to answer the question about how this is really affecting the housing market. Another thing that's limiting, at least from the point of view of the city, is that the Airbnb is providing data on how often their hosts are using the platform. But that information is anonymized, and so the city actually has to go through an extra step to try to get that information on each user. So it's not easy. We don't see that information. So when we, as journalists, do a public records request, we are not able to see the names of those people. And I know the reasons that Airbnb argued for that is for privacy of their hosts, and they didn't want to deal with the terms of service of their site. But it also makes it just hard to know who the violators are. Not for the city if they go through those extra steps and the companies comply with the subpoena. So for instance, we don't know, one of the things we hear anecdotally is, well, you can rent on Airbnb for 90 days and you can rent on VRBO for 90 days, and we don't know if they're really able to enforce that. And I don't know the answer to that question. The other thing that we have reported on anecdotally, but again, we don't have hard figures on, is how many people have been kicked out so that their landlords can turn their housing unit into an Airbnb. We have reported stories. We had this, the photo at the very beginning of our presentation. Someone spray painted on the sidewalk, this Airbnb displaced 5 people. And so we have anecdotes about this sort of thing. We've talked to people who have described exactly what's happened. We know it's happened. I just can't say how much it's happened. And then finally, these are some of the stories that you can read. If you go to this link again, bit.ly Lens Airbnb, April 2018. You can read our stories. And so that's some basic stuff, and I think we can go from here.
Okay, I'm supposed to pick up. Hi everybody, it's great to see everybody, and I guess this is probably the largest gathering I'll participate in before the end of my term. So Hugs all around. It's good to see so many neighborhoods represented here. It's been really my honor and privilege to represent you over these 8 years. And I'm very pleased to be turning the keys over to Joe Giarrusso, who I think is going to be a really great District A council person. So I'm looking forward to watching him work. So, all right, what I'm going to do tonight is just give you the procedural background to the extent that that may inform some of your questions, and try not to repeat too much that was just said. But prior to 2015, most short-term rentals in residential districts were illegal, and short-term means less than 30 days, or in the case of the French Quarter, less than 60 days. And so we all were used to, if you're going to lease a place, you lease it for a month at least, or you know, month to month, or a year lease, or whatever. But you could not do it less than 30 days or less than 60 days in the French Quarter. Do I already have a? Oh, okay, never mind. So the city always had trouble regulating this. And some of you know people who go out of town for Jazz Fest those 2 weeks, or for Mardi Gras, and they rent their house out while they're gone. That wasn't legal then, but there really wasn't any enforcement of it. But with the advent of platforms like Airbnb, the practice expanded exponentially, and the number of listings proliferated and finally reached a boiling point here, and we realized we had to do some regulation. So in August of 2015, the City Council passed a motion that directed the City Planning Commission to conduct a public hearing and a study about the regulation of short-term rentals. That was in August of 2015. The CPC held public hearings and did studying, and some 5 months later, in January of 2016, the City Planning Commission, CPC, recommended approval of a study that the staff had done with some amendment to it. The City Council reviewed the study, and then on May 5th of 2016, we passed a motion directing the City Planning Commission to consider creating a text amendment to the comprehensive zoning ordinance to adopt the City Planning Commission staff's recommendations in the short-term rental study. So we sent it back to the Commission to actually create a law around the study, what had come out of the study. On October 20th of 2016, the City Council took the first vote on the new zoning regulations that created 3 specific types of short-term rentals that were just spoken of a few minutes ago: the accessory, the temporary, and the commercial. And we've kept those definitions up there for you so that while you're formulating your questions, you will know what each type is. To go over it one more time, the short-term rental accessory is the one where you have to have a homestead exemption on the property, and you can rent out rooms up to 3 guest rooms with 6 total guests in your own home. And you have to be present when you do this, when you have this rental. Or if you have a double, then you can have the other side of the double can be rented by no more than 3 guests and 6 total guests. And again, you have to have the homestead exemption, and you have to be present when you're renting out. Then the next step is the temporary. The temporary license allows an entire unit. Each unit can have no more than 5 guest rooms, and you can rent it out not more than 90 days out of the year. So this legalizes the folks who go out of town for Jazz Fest and Mardi Gras and rent out their homes. Unfortunately, because there's no homestead exemption required, it also legalizes anybody from anywhere buying homes in New Orleans and renting them out, even though they live in Arizona and don't have the slightest idea what kind of trouble those renters are causing. And that temporary rental, which is the whole unit for up to 90 days, That's not allowed in the View Carré. So then there's commercial short-term rentals, and that is in commercial and mixed-use districts. And it allows whole units with no more than 5 guest rooms to be rented out. And you can have a development that has, you know, any number of units in it, and every one of them can be rented out as a short-term rental. The only limitation is five guest rooms, which is a lot of guest rooms. So at the time of this vote, when these were up for a vote, I offered some amendments. One, to require homestead exemptions for temporary short-term rental license, those whole house rentals in neighborhoods, in residential districts. And that, I lost on that attempted amendment. I had 2 other votes, Councilmember Cantrell and Councilman Brosette. I also put in an amendment to increase the amount of information that has to be posted outside the property when there is a short-term rental happening, and I did get that passed. Then I also offered an amendment to further restrict what zoning districts could have commercial short-term rentals, because, you know, a lot of the mixed-use districts have a lot of residential in them. And I also could not get that amendment through. Again, Councilmember Cantrell and Brosette both voted for it, so it was 4-3 vote, and I lost that amendment. Then this was a motion. So when we're going to do an ordinance, you start by doing a motion, and if it passes the council, then it goes to the legal department, and they turn the motion into an ordinance. And then it has to come back and be voted on again before it's finally the law. So I voted for the motion because I thought we were desperate for regulation. And I was hoping to be able to, you know, to do a little more negotiating between the motion and the ordinance stage and get some more changes in there. On December 1st of 2016, the council took up the land use ordinance this time, and for those, I voted again in favor of amendments that required a homestead exemption for temporary short-term rentals, and also for a limit of 60 days rather than 90 days on the temporaries. And I voted for an amendment to limit the accessory and temporary short-term rentals to 1 per block face. Unfortunately, all of these amendments were voted down with Councilmember Cantrell and Brosette and I in the minority. So ultimately, at that point, I decided that the regulations didn't provide enough protection for the neighborhoods, and I voted against the entire regulation. But I believe it was myself and Councilmember Brosette who voted ultimately against the whole thing. Okay, along with those 3 forms of rentals, there were also some other things that we passed. We passed legislation to provide for data sharing and tax collection agreements with the Airbnb, which they agreed to do that, the others didn't. We also voted to require $1 per night to be charged to the renters and to go to the neighborhood housing improvement fund, supposedly to help us have money for more affordable housing. However, to date, according to the Jane Place study, we've only collected $230,000, which they say is basically enough for 1 affordable unit to be built. So obviously we need work there. And we also passed an ordinance creating licensing categories in the city code. So to the enforcement that's happening today, even though we've gotten Airbnb to agree to data sharing and and VRBO and HomeAway and the other Expedia family companies are sending some reports to us. We're getting some data from them, and even though Airbnb is sending us is collecting taxes for us to help with regulation, it's very, very cumbersome. All the reports are different. It's very difficult to figure out the data from the reports and to compare. There's, like, they don't give addresses and names in the initial reports from Airbnb. You have to subpoena them. So the reports are about a month behind to begin with. And then when you go to subpoena for names and addresses of certain ones, then it's another, close to a month to get that information. And so you're very behind on enforcement there. Let's see. Okay, and only Airbnb is somewhat complying with the subpoenas, and the others are not complying with those. So there's they're trying to enforce. I mean, we're getting hearings done set up all the time, and some goodly fines when these hearings are had, and the case is made for an illegal short-term rental. But it's just really just a drop in the bucket, really. I'd like to commend Jane Place, the Lens also, for the work they've been doing to inform the public, and Jane Place for the report that illuminated many of our enforcement challenges and gave recommendations for policy and legislative changes. That one of their recommendations is that the licenses for the platforms themselves, Airbnb, for instance, or HomeAway, they would be required to get a license to operate in New Orleans. Now, when we did the Uber and Lyft legislation a few years back, we made those platforms get their own licenses, and them getting those licenses was conditioned upon them following the rules that we created for them. And they balked initially, but boy, when they were staring down Jazz Fest, they came and got their permits and decided to go with the rules. So I think that is really an important thing for us to do. If I've been involved with this in the beginning, because I was involved in writing the Uber legislation, I would have done this requirement for licenses. Jane Place also suggests one host, one home idea, which is the idea that basically we were trying to advance with the requiring homestead exemptions. If you own the home and you live in the home and you've got your homestead exemption there, then you can rent out rooms, or if it's in our existing regulation, it's only doubles. But I would say if you have a 3-plex or 4-plex, if you've got your homestead exemption in it, that you should be able to rent out one of those as a short-term rental. Why am I not concerned? Because you live there, and you are going to make sure that your rental, your renters are gonna, not destroy the quality of life of you or the people around you. So that's why I would agree with that. Okay. So what's happening now? It's been about a year, and the council has now filed a motion once again asking the City Planning Commission to look at all this. Look at the data, look at what's working, look what's not working, and report back to us. So the City Planning Commission staff is starting on that work now. And we're asking them to look at the whole kit and caboodle, and whether any modifications or additional restrictions are warranted, including block face limits, spacing requirements, density caps, licensure caps, homestead exemption requirements, increased fees, and compliance standards. So just like in 2016, once the study is completed and transmitted to the council will take into consideration and then direct the CPC to consider actual changes to the zoning ordinance and city code. And there will be numerous opportunities for public meetings and opportunities to speak both before the City Planning Commission and the City Council. So I encourage everyone to stay engaged and share your thoughts with the City Planning Commission. You can go online to the City Planning Commission and email them and their staff, as well as the new City Council and Mayor, because I'm going to be passing the baton on this one. So, thank you. I hope that gives you the whole idea of the process. And we, again, are opening it up. And so this is our opportunity to speak loudly and clearly. And you got to know, when you email council members, we read it, we hear it, we count them. We really do. Your voice is a very political voice, and especially when you're all speaking together, or a lot of you are speaking together. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. I want to thank CAN also for hosting this tonight and for all the neighborhood associations who are here. But also I'm encouraged because I see people here from outside District A who are here to listen about this issue as well. I'm probably going to talk a little bit more anecdotally because that's the space I've lived in for the last couple of years. Like Susan and so many of you, I come from a neighborhood organization as well. I was the president of Lakeview Civic in 2016. My involvement with short-term rentals began in 2015 when I think there was starting to be discussion at that point about the motion and the ordinances. And it was interesting because what we heard Steve say earlier with the statistics is really there's a couple of intersections here. I think that's what we're kind of hearing around our comments tonight is one is about enforcement and the other one's sort of about general policy. And so while a number of us were debating how short-term rentals should work, what do they look like, how much should the cap be in a certain area, there are a stronger voice in the Lakeview neighborhood that said we don't trust city government, so we don't want it involved at all. And that was the view that I had to send to Susan in 2016. And so there wasn't really a voice at the table because they said absolutely nothing at all. We're not sure we're going to get this right. So that was interesting. And then as I started running for office, of course, one of the first things you do if you have the ability is you start doing some polling, right? And I asked the guys to poll a number of hot issues and we spent money on it. And the first thing they came back and told me is crime and streets are the biggest issues in District A. And I said, really guys, thank you for letting me pay you so much money to tell me what I could have told you to begin with, right? Short-term rentals really was not a high polling issue. And it surprised me because, and I think Susan can attest to this and anybody else who's run for office, you have to really separate out what I call the white noise versus what's real. And sometimes that hot area may not be reality, but I felt like on the trail that I was hearing about short-term rentals a fairly good deal. Now this is kind of to me where the surprise was. Our polling showed that people in Lakeview didn't like it because, again, they were afraid of enforcement. But on the trail, the area that people talked to me the most about it was in Mid-City. I would have thought certainly Carrollton and Uptown, Maple maybe even too, would have been the hotter spots. But when I got pulled to the side, it was really Mid-City that began having that conversation with us. I have a couple more statistics, although one of mine from the city is a little dated at this point. You heard Steve say tonight that there were about 4,500 licenses for STR. When we were going through some of our transition meetings with the city, the mayor gave us some, and it was a breakdown by districts. And I'm about 1,000 behind right now, so I can't attest to what the 4,500 breakdown is, but I can tell you where we were when we had about 3,500 licenses. Can anybody guess the district that had the highest number of short-term rentals? I'll give you a hint, it's not District A. Anybody? C. That's what I would have thought too. You're wrong. District B is number one, far and away. My guess is because of the French Quarter having a limitation, it's not it. District B was 1,450 licenses. District C was about 950. Then District A with around 711. And then there's a pretty big drop-off. District D, which is essentially Lake Vista, Lake Terrace, Gentilly, the Ninth Ward, a little bit of New Orleans East, had a little over 500, and then District E had roughly 63. So my gut reaction without seeing the new numbers is that probably B and C will be pretty competitive, but that I was surprised, I think as you were, that the difference between B and C was so high. The other thing I thought that was interesting, we've heard Steve tonight talk about the James Place report. Susan mentioned it as well. I thought one of the interesting statistics in there was that in addition to all of the licenses, and they were working with roughly a 4,300 number in their report, we're now up to 4,500, as Steve said, that there were roughly about 2,800, 2,744 listings on Airbnb that had not yet registered, but those accounted for nearly 53,000 nights. I want to repeat that, 53,000 nights of people who had gotten an STR who didn't have a license to do so. So once again, you're seeing this marriage of policy and enforcement back together. So I think Susan sort of framed the issue well at the end. If I were you, I guess I'd be asking two things. Well, where are we going, and what does the future look like? Susan's exactly right. I think the CPC study is underway. I would suspect that the work that James Place has done will inform some of the CPC work. I would certainly think it would answer some of the questions that I have. I would certainly like to see the platform share their raw data. I also agree with Steve that statistics can be shown to show certain things, and so I think it would be good as best as possible to compare apples to apples. But I also think that you had a number of us who ran on short-term rental reform, and I see Robert Moore sitting over there, and we've had this discussion already that I think at least 4 of us are fairly committed to some early action on this front. So I would expect to see that as well. I would certainly like to see the data as it comes out, and we look forward to hearing tonight from the audience about what you have to say with your own experiences and what those white cards are. Thank you.
Okay, the white cards are here. Thank you so much, Susan and Joe and Steve, if you're still here. Keith is going to talk a little bit. He's going to pick up the white cards that we've already picked up. Does anybody else have a white card that needs to be picked up? No, that's fine. So Keith is going to talk a little bit about it for the next, or at least ask the question. This Q&A period is about between 20 minutes to a 30-minute section, unless you all want to stay a little bit longer. I know Joe and Susan have agreed to stay here a little longer after the event on a one-on-one discussion if you need it.
All right, I have a lot more comment cards than question cards up here. So I'm going to summarize a few of the comments. I'm going to move on to the questions because we need to take advantage of the opportunity to have our elected officials here. And then depending on how time goes, I might go into more detail on some of the comments. I will tell you that about 40% of these cards are people who think that short-term rentals are at least partially a good thing. I have several cards here from people who either themselves or they know somebody who was able to purchase a home because they could do short-term rental in part of that home. But I will also say that almost every single one of these people who say they favor them and even own properties that have short-term rentals are also saying enforcement is a problem, and they, I think almost universally, are saying that there needs to be a link between a homestead exemption in Orleans Parish and being able to do this. The comments that are more negative, a lot of people have had experienced very bad renters, short-term renters in the neighborhoods of properties that are being allowed to have far more tenants at a short-term rental than they're supposed to. One person here cites an example of a property that has space for 10, recently had 22 people there. A lot of concerns about enforcement and concerns about the platforms themselves. And then there's some people here who are pretty clearly just opposed to short-term rentals in general. I want to move into some of the questions, and then I'll get maybe back to some more of the specifics of the comments. Susan, I think this is more for you. You mentioned $1 figure, but the question is, are there any numbers for how much the city is getting for short-term rentals? Do you have any more information beyond what you shared?
I didn't get that information. Let me see if when Gordon comes back to the room, if he's got it. I do know, it's a pretty significant number. I'm sorry that I can't tell you that. I didn't think to get that. Okay. Gordon, Gordon, let me put you on the spot here, Gordon. Do you know anything about how much we're collecting for short-term rentals? For license fees, tax?
I can look it up real quick and tell you.
Okay, good.
We'll,
All right,
we'll get back. We'll get back to you guys on that one. Another question here: are non-attached units such as mother-in-law apartments legal to be used for short-term rentals?
No, they are not.
And Keith, can I jump
Yeah,
in right there?
absolutely.
Again, I mean, since I haven't stepped into office and I'm relying on what other people are giving me, I think I'm the anecdotal voice tonight. One of the things I think we've heard is that people are converting their garages to space, right? I mean, we keep on hearing a lot of things about maybe politely unique spaces being used as rental opportunities and renting out literally your garage. Not something that's a mother-in-law suite or back of your house or attached to the top of your house, your garage as a place that people want to live in as well.
Right, and you know, there's many reasons for that, land use reasons, et cetera. I mean, if you live in a residential neighborhood that is a single-family neighborhood district, then that means there's supposed to be just a single family on that property, and if you start allowing another building on the property, that just goes against a lot of our zoning and really could just traditionally could result in that being a two-family household.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here and ask how that differs from renting out a room in your house.
Thank you, Gordon. Gordon, do you have any ideas on why using an accessory building is worse than renting out a room in your house?
My recollection was when the legislation was being developed was that there was already a lot of garage and storage building conversion for the purposes of short-term rental, or at least that was a concern of Department of Safety and Permits. And so it has to be a legal dwelling unit, and that was just where it fell as far as the administration was concerned.
And folks, this is Gordon McLeod. He's my chief of staff and my land use guru. He's got a couple of degrees in this area, and so I lean heavily on him for this. And what we've come up with here is actually just the cost of the permits, the fee schedule, which for accessory rental is $200 a year. A temporary with a homestead exemption is $50 per application period. You know, it's that 90-day limit. The temporary without a homestead exemption is $150 per application period, and the commercial is $500 a year. And considering what people are making on these, that's really kind of low if you ask me. But as far as what we're collecting, I'm afraid I'll have to get back to everybody with that one.
Okay, here's a question. I'm kind of interpreting it here. Is there anything in the legislation that prevents a homeowner, from forcing a renter to leave their premises in favor of a short-term rental, even just for a week?
No, it's, private property rights kind of thing. If I heard the question right, it's, unless the renter has a lease, then for a certain term, then there's nothing to stop a homeowner, property owner from telling the tenant at the end of his month-to-month or at the end of his lease, he's got to go. Don't have to give a reason.
Yeah, I was thinking that might be a question that came up. Susan's 100% right. I mean, I guess it depends whether or not you have to give somebody a certain amount of notice before their lease is up, number one. And then number two is it doesn't apply necessarily if your landlord tries to kick you out, but if somebody tries to sell your residence where you live, you can actually record your lease and that recordation in the mortgage and conveyance office is good against the world, so the new owner can't kick you out as long as your lease is in effect. So that's another safeguard potentially as well.
Is there any kind of a hotline that people can call to complain about problem short-term rentals?
Sure, it said 311, huh? 311?
There's an anonymous way to report short-term rentals through safety and permits website.
Would you use the mic, please?
Up here.
There's a portal on short-term rentals on Safety and Permits website where you can report them anonymously.
I'm going to follow up on that question myself. So given that 311 only operates during regular business hours, and I would imagine that most of these short-term rental problems may not occur during those hours, going forward, I guess this is for Joe, would you consider establishing some kind of a dedicated line for short-term rental?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a good idea to start, Keith. The other thing I would highly recommend is by your local liaison officer, formerly known as quality of life officer, maybe a hot meal or some donuts or something, because, you know, those guys do get called a whole lot in addition to 311, and frequently people in the neighborhood, when they want immediate action, that's who they look to. So each district has a quality of life. I still call them a quality of life officer, even though the name has changed. But
I think they just reinstated that.
yes, correct. They're back in the district. So having that person's information would probably be equally helpful too.
Also, I think that if you can report it to the what is it, the email address for safety and permits. They are supposed to have nighttime and after-hour inspectors, and we know that there have been some inspections that have been done at nights and on weekends. So you should be able to report through that email address on the Safety and Permits website.
All right.
Page.
How is it possible that some licenses listed on the city's site for short-term rentals have been issues, but the status reads license fee not paid?
Not understanding that question.
I'm interpreting this to say that according to the Woody City's website, there are people who have been issued their short-term rental license, even though they have not yet paid their license fee.
I don't know. Don't know about that.
Let's see. This may be something of a rhetorical question, but how are vacation rentals actually helping local property owners versus hurting them?
Vacation rentals. And
Yeah, I'm presuming the question meant short-term rentals.
yeah, well, assuming they mean the temporary
Yeah.
kind where the homeowner can not be there, or really doesn't even have to own the home, the temporary kind. I mean, if you own the home and you're going away for a month or 2 months, and obviously it's going to be financially beneficial if you can rent out the home. And to me, as long as there was a requirement for a homestead exemption, that would mean that's your home. And you're going to be renting it out for, say, 2 months to somebody. You're going to be very careful about who you rent it to. And when you get back home, you will have to face your neighbors if the people you rented it to did not, affected their quality of life. So that's why I think really the homestead exemption is the key to limiting the number of these things that we have in our city, and it's also the key to making sure that that short-term rental uses are not going to affect the quality of life of a neighborhood. Because there's only certain people who would rent out a room. You know, you either really need it to help pay your mortgage, or you're just a really friendly person and you like the company. There's just certain kinds of people. I know I could not ever rent out a room in my house. I would just go bonkers, and with different people coming and going in my house. And you know, if you have a double or whatever, then again, it's safe because you live in the house, and so you're going to be careful. And I think that too, that takes a certain kind of person too, because you're going to have cleanup all the time, people rotating in and out, as opposed to having a long-term renter, but you'll make a lot more money. So I just think that the key is tying things to a homestead exemption.
And there's several people up here who absolutely make that recommendation. Actually, require a homestead exemption for short-term rentals. That's repeated on several of these comment cards. Joe, I think this question is more directed at you, acknowledging that we have an affordable housing problem that is significant in New Orleans. Short-term rentals are not the only policy solution needed. What will you do generally to enhance affordability of rental housing and home ownership in New Orleans?
Ooh. All right, well, let's start with the short-term rentals. Susan, I think Steve talked a little bit about how little are being contributed to the neighborhood participation fund, also known as the NIF. I would like to see, if we're going to continue down this route, those amounts raised. I think the licensing fees are what, $200, $150 each, and only 1% return, and we have $200,000 a year. I don't think that's good enough. I think one of the other major things, Keith, we talked about this, and I've heard Councilmember-elect Palmer talk about it as well, is we have all these systems that fit in place, right? And if you listen to her, somebody who has worked with affordable housing, there is still housing here in the area, but one of the major issues is transportation. If you live, and I see some head nodding out there, if you live in Algiers or Lower 9 or New Orleans East, it shouldn't take you 45 minutes or an hour to get to the CBD. Conversely, if you want to go from Lakeview to Metairie, you have to go from Lakeview to downtown and then downtown to Metairie. That doesn't make any sense. One of the things Susan and I have also discussed, and hopefully we can start working on this some more, is that there are certain places where our RTA routes stop, which don't make sense. So if you want to go to Ochsner, you have to stop at the city line and then walk a mile over. So transportation, I think, is going to help start reducing those. There's also, in fairness, I think, been reports that rental rates are starting to tick down. You see it, certainly there was a big story about it in the French Quarter, and then also locally as well. So as we start increasing stock, I think you're going to start seeing some affordable housing issues hopefully pan out for the better.
All right, I'm going to move on to some very specific recommendations that people have put up here. One simply says no short-term rentals in residential zones. One suggests that in commercial zones, short-term rentals be allowed for 120 days, but those properties be taxed at a commercial property rate. And this person actually also has a comment that he or she thinks that short-term rentals are something of a novelty, and that as that novelty wears off, there will be less demand for short-term rentals. I don't know. That didn't work out so well for Anheuser-Busch on the craft beer thing, so I would say don't count on it. Several people comment that the short-term rental platform should be absolutely required to provide the data, and I think, Susan, that goes back to what you said maybe about revisiting their licensing requirements. Yeah, a number of people brought that up. Enforcement is just something people really address, that the city needs to put more into it. Maybe we should have less people enforcing parking and more people enforcing short-term rental.
Well, wait. Can I say something about that? Actually, this is a hobby horse of mine. According to the budget, we have 90, at least 2017 budget, we had 97 people assigned to City Hall to hand out parking tickets. We had 47 people in blight and code enforcement. Those numbers seem reversed to me. We ought to have more people in blight enforcement and safety and permits and making sure the city's running correctly than making sure we're handing out parking tickets, particularly in residential neighborhoods. So if you support that stance, please send me emails. I would be welcome to have those so we can go to the administration and right-size the other departments that need that extra help.
I teed that one up for you.
I appreciate the fact we're working together there.
So here's a question that just arrived. Who are the opposition to regulating and limiting short-term rentals?
Well, certainly the platforms are the big opposition. And, you know, we had to negotiate with the platforms when we did this first round last year of law, because if to the extent that we're not getting data from them, which they don't have the obligation to give us, we can't hardly do any enforcement. Everything would be just by individuals, you all out there, reporting problems. And so we need to have their cooperation. And we either do that by not restricting so much so that they agree to cooperate, or we make them get a license, like we do with Uber and Lyft. And then they can only keep their license if they do the things that our law requires them to do, such as give data and give it in a way that it is comparable, that everyone gives data in the same way. So I think that's the biggest thing. I mean, there of course are also people who are buying multiple homes and renting them out in commercial areas, and they of course do not want the restrictions either. But I think you'll find that many, if not most of them, don't live here.
All right, just a couple more comments up here. This one is actually from someone who owns a property that they do short-term rental on, but this person is very much calling for stricter enforcement and highest possible fines for people who are violators. And then this person notes that short-term rentals favor younger citizens, many of whom didn't live here before Katrina. Long-term residents, middle-aged and older people will be leaving. We're not interested in living next door to short-term rentals. So I think that's pretty much the bulk of what has been brought up here. We got one more card coming to the wire.
And when that's done, I'd like to go ahead, and we're supposed to have been listening here, so I've been good and I've listened, and now I'd like to say what I really think.
And then, Keith, can I say one more thing to that? There are, you know, one of the Carrollton area groups brought this up. There are a couple bills in the legislature right now looking to cap property taxes over a period of time. So that way, your property assessment isn't $5 in 2018, but then $10 in 2019. And some of the thought process there is because you're seeing the proliferation of people either moving to town or because of the short-term rentals or whatever forces are driving the market, that people who've lived in historically lower taxed areas, particularly Marigny Bywater, are being pushed out because the property taxes are going up. So the legislature is actually looking at a way to try and cap those for a period of time so people aren't as affected.
All right, and this is our last question just arrived. It's something we have kind of discussed a little bit. Why not use the license enforcement to gather data and not rely on compliance Airbnb data?
Well, because once you get the license, I mean, the person, the property owner is going to say, yes, I'm going to abide by these rules for, say, a temporary license. I'll only rent it out 90 days, only so many people, only so many guests per stay, etc. But there's no way to see if they're actually doing that without getting the data from the platforms. So you can only find out initially when you give them a license. You can only find out what they say they're going to do. And then, of course, I mean, you could follow up by going out to visit them, but then you'd have to happen to be there when there's a rental, and maybe one rental will be authorized under the temporary license, but the next one they're going to have next week is going to be 20 people when it's supposed to be limited to a lot less than that. You know, it's really something that only the data from the platform can give you sufficient information for that enforcement.
All right, well, I certainly want to thank both of you, and Susan, you had some thoughts to share.
So, I just can say that I believe that if a short-term rental is limited to people who have a homestead exemption, our neighborhoods will stay the same fabric that they are, that we've known them to be all along. Because anybody who's living there is going to make sure that the people who rent their house are not affecting the quality of life of the people around them. And so that would be, to me, the way. That's when you talk about, oh, you want to help somebody who's got, a mortgage to stay in their house. That's the kind of short-term rental I think would be good for the city and good for the people. But what you have here with these short-term rentals, the way we have it now, we have indeed heard story after story of renters being kicked out of their residences by property owners who then begin using it for short-term rental. And you got to understand it as in terms of just a business decision, because you get a lot more money if you short-term rental. So it's happening, and it's happening pretty significantly. And then, of course, when it comes to those people who are coming in, or those companies who do this all across the country, they buy homes where they can short-term rental them. And so they will pay a high price for those homes. And that means the prices of the homes around go up. So here I am living with my family in a home that is, by the way, the local government has told me is a residential district, that I won't have a business next door to me and across the street from me, and yet that's exactly what these short-term rentals are. They're businesses. And so people are buying these houses at top price because they're going to be making so much money off of them. And then the assessor looks around and says, look at the houses in this area. They're going for a higher amount. And then he assesses their value for purposes of property tax at a higher rate. And then here I am trying to live in my house with my family and pay my mortgage and pay my insurance, and it gets to a point where I can't afford to live in my own home anymore. And that is what I think we are seeing. And I've talked to the assessor, and he tells me that he cannot do anything about it. He can't figure out who's buying homes to short-term rental them and who's buying homes as their homes. So he just has to go off the current sales prices when he's assessing properties in an area. And that's, that's what I think we're seeing. And we're really, I think, adversely affecting our people by doing this. And for those of you who have short-term rentals, I get it. I mean, I have a small apartment in my home, and I sit down and figure out what I could get. It's in an area that's right down from downtown. I could get a goodly amount if I did a short-term rental on that. And it's just, it's an understandable business decision that people make. And if you own rental property in a mixed use or commercial, and you don't, you can rent out the whole thing to short-term rental, I understand it. But because of the disruption it is for those of us who are permanent residents here, I really think we need to restrict it further. Can I ask? Can we answer a question?
I'm confused about the 90-day limit. Is that on all of them?
No, it has to be in a residential district. You see, that's why the commercial is different, because it's mixed use and commercial zoning districts that can happen in. So temporary is like accessory in that we're talking about in residential districts. So in residential districts, you can't rent out a whole property or a whole unit within a property for the whole year.
Is there a map somewhere we can look at of where those districts are? I know it's not residential. Like Constance Street,
It was probably residential.
Whole house numbers, double, at least 10 bedrooms in the place. If that's not limited in time, it just destroys it.
Right.
Cindy, just for your information, if you have a specific address to the property that you are referring to, or any property that you might have in question, if you go to One Stop, or if you go to the real estate people's, real property viewer from the city hall, you will actually get everything that is specific to that property, including the name of the owner, how much they paid for it, what they were assessed, what the zoning is, and if there are any other zoning related and land use related issues. So you will get that information from the real property website. So I want to take this time. To thank Susan and Joe for sticking around with us for a little bit. And I also want to thank each one of you for coming and making this a good event for us. Now is time for us to celebrate and to salute Susan. So I want to take the moment first to allow the Holly Grove Dixon Neighborhood Association to say a few words.
First of all, I want to say thank you for being the servant leader that you have been. I live in one of the smallest neighborhoods in the city of New Orleans, but that did not deter the vision from devoting her time and coming to our meetings. We only had 3 people there, but she still came. So the size did not mean anything, it was the quality. And because she was such a good person to our association, our neighborhood, I want to present a little plaque. And it says, in honor and heartfelt appreciation for your unselfish, extraordinary service to the Holly Grove Dixon community. You served with compassion and integrity while embracing a vision and commitment to be inclusive to the growth of the Holly Grove Dixon Neighborhood Association for District A, City of New Orleans from 2010 to 2018. We love you.
Well, Susan, you have helped all of the neighborhoods at Carrollton. So Carrollton area...
No, you're not supposed to stand in front of the speakers, really.
Carrollton Area Network proudly presents to you a plaque that talks about the virtues of living in Carrollton, and part of that is the last sentence. It includes a lot of the neighborhood characteristics, but at the bottom it tells you how much we really appreciate you being our council member. I'll pass it around for those who want to read a little bit about it. It's a long one.
Becky has cards.
Right above me
And-
is Peacock, by the way.
Yeah. So one of the things that we thought we might do is let the people who are here who have expressed some gratitude and some kind words to you, Susan, I'm going to let Becky speak to that.
Susan, in no particular order, I'm going to read you what people said on these yellow cards. Ms. Susan Guidry, thank you for helping homeowners and for understanding the community. Thank you. Have a good rest after your faithful service. And we're going to give you these when it's over. We, the Irish Channel and French Quarter, the whole city, can't thank you enough
for all you've done for housing and our neighborhoods, with your stalwart support of policies that would rein in STRs, whether or not they were supported by all. So happy to see your successor following your lead in so many ways. Thank you for the Robert's grocery store. Susan, thank you for your excellent service and responsiveness, particularly your work on criminal justice. Thank you for your leadership to eliminate monetary bail for most municipal offenses, limit the number of prisoners allowed no JC, assure mental health and substance abuse services, and hold the sheriff accountable. Thank you for finally getting our storm drain cleaned on your end. I called countless times to report, and finally when I reached out to you, they cleaned it right away. You helped me with illegal dumping, helped me getting the city to pick up trash, and helped me getting abandoned cars picked up and towed. Needing help now with sewage and water bills. Thank you for working to protect all of our neighborhoods. Please don't allow Airbnb types of rentals in Audubon neighborhood. Meanwhile, your years of work have been very reassuring to my husband and me. I'm sure you remember Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on TV. Since grade school, we all grew up learning, knowing all the words to who are the people in the neighborhood. They're the people you meet when you're walking down the street. It's the people you see every day. You're taking away our neighborhood in the purest sense of the word. I think this is a good comment. What I appreciate about Susan, hopefully she will listen to our voice of concern. Thank you for helping Carrollton Riverbend resolve disputes among many other things. And thank you for a wonderful staff. Thanks for all your hard work and taking a tougher stand on STRs. Hope the next phase of your life goes well. Thanks for all the years. It's been reassuring to know you were there. Thanks, Susan. Really appreciate your criminal justice efforts. Take some time off and come back. Thank you for being the best city council member in the whole 35 years I've lived in Nolan, and the best party goer as well. Thank you, Councilwoman Susan Guidry.
And everybody signed this card.
And I want to take this opportunity to thank my incredible staff. Lord, you've heard from us tonight. 4 other incredible staff that are not here tonight. They served you and me very well, and I'll be taking them out to dinner this Friday to celebrate that, and also my sheriff's office security and driver, so just driving much and I drive myself. But anyway, this is too sweet, y'all. I really appreciate it all. It really has been my honor and pleasure to serve you. And I feel like we have now come through the recovery process and now on to the next step, which is growing to be a better and more efficient and stay a lovely city. We are the best city in the country.
So, Susan, you're handing over the baton to this gentleman, right, on May 7th, is that correct?
Yeah, well, I'm going to do it after Thursday, that Thursday of Jazz Fest.
Oh.
So somebody set a council meeting for the Thursday, the local day of Jazz Fest. My husband and I are 7-day festers. It is in my district, so I'm working. So I've told Joe I'm going to hand the keys over Thursday after the meeting. My staff will be there on Friday. He's welcome to come in and bring his staff in, and they can all talk about it. I won't be there. And you know where I'll be Saturday and Sunday.
Yes. We'll see you at the fairground. So Joe, would you stand up for a moment? Yeah, I know that you and Susan have worked together for all these months since you've been voted in. And if you've gone to neighborhood association meetings, you know that Joe's already been on the job. He's come to many of our meetings and listened and started working for us already. So thank you for that. So as we were listening to you, people wrote cards of appreciation for you and things they want you to be aware of going forward. So, okay, so we'll give you these, but here they are. I'm going to start with the good one. Looking forward to your inauguration, Councilman-elect Giarrusso. So, look forward to that. Joe, there's several more about short-term rentals. So we need you to be strong on controls on STRs. They're destroying our neighborhood. So there's several of those. It's important to enforce and fine people who are not completely complying with short-term rentals. I'll give you all these, so you don't have to take notes. So they want to know how this can be done. More about let's rein in the short-term rentals before they destroy us. Okay, welcome, Joe. Now it starts. Short-term rentals. There's new changes. Adams and Oak, the Stray Cafe, garbage cans on the street for trash from bars, snacks, so if it doesn't mess up our sidewalk and landscaping. Yes. Adams and Oak. Okay. Mr. Joe, thank you for being here and taking the time for helping us with short-term rentals and Airbnb. Okay, thanks for your responsiveness to our neighborhood organization so far. Please keep it up. Yeah, that's a great idea. Just please take a measured approach to STRs and hold the line on no monetary bail for most municipal offenses while working to find a system through appropriate rather than fees and fines which place an undue burden on the poor people and the people of color in our city. Please work to reduce the number of our citizens who are incarcerated for non-violent minor offenses. Also, please work for systems and programs that prevent crime and facilitate successful reentry. Joe, your pledging support for Planned Parenthood in New Orleans meant everything to me. I helped start Planned Parenthood in Louisiana in 1983. Meanwhile, I hope you will forestall short-term rentals in our Audubon neighborhood. The town has changed so much since Katrina. Too many decisions about development are being done according to textbook urban planning, when these decisions should be made according to individual situations by seasoned personnel who know our city and the dynamics of our neighborhood. Welcome, Joe. Here are my concerns. A major concern is the proliferation of bars and restaurants on and around Maple Street. Also, illegal commercial restaurants in Hillel on Broadway. Attempts to increase density in or around St. Charles and Carrollton. Joe, make it right, please. There is absolutely no reliable enforcement out there to cover the roles as they are in place now. Hi, Joe. My concern is about group homes in our neighborhood for those recovering from addiction. There's one across the street, another a block away, probably several in our area. People hang out on the front and smoke, have very loud conversations, none that I want to hear. So they want to know, are group homes regulated? As the residents change, the cars change, it's hard to keep up. We miss Holly Grove Farm. We love Palmer Park. This is a big one, for me at least. Would you support rescinding the new energy power plant approval? I want to clap for that one. Okay, so Joe, we need you to, we read that one already? And this one already? The last one is welcome aboard from all the Holly Grove neighbors. Yes. So we wish you the best, and I look forward to, I think, as all of us do, working with you in the future.
My voice doesn't project very well, so I like the microphone. I just want to say two things very quickly. The first is I asked some of my new staff to be here tonight because I realized this would be a big gathering, and so I wanted to introduce them very quickly. Gordon is not new to the office, but he will be staying aboard, so he will be handling chief of staff and land use issues. I'm glad to see that you got the applause. Amanda Rizzo will be joining the office as constituent services, and Ashley Spears as legislative director. And the second thing is, I'd like to be the last person to add to the praise of Susan. You know, this may come as a great surprise to all of you, but not all politicians are free and giving with their time and guidance and willing to help with the transition. And Susan has been there really since October 18th. Whatever question I have, no matter how picayune, no matter when it is, how do I handle this, what is going on, what is the proper process, what is the procedure, she's been unflailing in her willingness to answer, to spend time. We've had dedicated meetings. I know she's trying to bolt out of City Hall as quickly as she possibly can. I will keep the engine idle on the Friday that you're at Jazz Fest. But really, I'm very appreciative and all the time and guidance that you've given. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being patient with us. We ran a few minutes later than we had expected, and I guess we can socialize on the other side while we take some time to clean up this side. Thank you very much.
Thank you.